right? So we looked at Langdon-Winner's paper, and we saw that technology does encode certain rules, right? Right? You could think in probably in two ways, right? One is that to operate the technology itself, it demands certain relationships, and then once it is operating, it imposes certain relationships on direct and indirect users. Yeah. Right. So the broad point, of course, is that we've seen again and again, right, that like over here, technology was used as a tool to control workers, and that was one of the driving motivations behind introducing technology, right? So even inferior technology was introduced, but done temporarily to basically break the unions, right? So that's one example where the technology is used as a tool. Yeah. Similarly, right, we were then started discussing other characteristics, right? Characteristics that a technology should have so that it is more likely that it leads to more ethical outcomes, right? So here Mumford talked about authoritarian and democratic different technologies, right? Certain technologies are authoritarian by nature, right? They need authoritarian management structures or they impose authoritarian structures on society, whereas some are more democratic than others, right? So these are some examples, and then similar arguments were made by Ivan Illich that we saw of that once you do introduce complex technology, then it also means that now to control this technology, you then need many other social structures as well, and which can then have this second order effect, right? So you need you need higher education and so on, and then higher education, then you start talking about who has access to higher education and who are the ones who then end up in the seat of the people who are actually controlling these technologies, right? And then right, so you see those kinds of patterns coming up, right? Then Lawrence Lessig talked about the internet. We discussed copyright, right? Of how the architecture of the internet itself, because of anonymous communication, right? Because of decentralized systems, it made it easy for people to share knowledge, right? But then we also saw the backlash where technologies like digital rights management or other surveillance technologies are now being introduced, and specifically this is from a commercial point of view to prevent to enforce copyright, right? To prevent free sharing of content, right? So we see this occurring again and again, right? We talked about some of these cryptographic technologies, right? So and then finally what we said was that one of the lenses through which we can start thinking about systems is that who are they really empowering, right? And here we saw that literature on theories of power has broadly looked at it in terms of 3 to 4 levels, right? One, the first level at which you think about power is in terms of if somebody has more resources, then are those resources giving more decision-making power to that person? Decision-making power is that they are able to affect, they're able to influence the outcomes, right? So that this level then starts telling us about that are these resources equally distributed, right? So for example, we are talking about education, right? And if education is required for certain decision making processes, but everybody doesn't have equal access to education, so it will result in the elite who do have higher education being able to influence others, right? Then the second level is in terms of rules, right? Who has made these rules in the first place? And these rules might be favoring certain kinds of outcomes, right? And then at the next level, you get into who is able to build these rules, right? And that's where it becomes important, right? To think about that, okay, how do you change these rules, right? Rules will only be changed when people ask questions or when people are able to question through things like grievance redressal structures, through social audits, and this also means that there is a aspect of knowledge, right? So we talked about Foucault and how he connected knowledge with power, right? So his main point was that if you're able to control knowledge, right, if you're able to control how people think, then it will make it easier to entrench power, to entrench the structures of power. Right, this is where media plays a big role, right? Right, but what Foucault also said is that because if you're able to define knowledge and what kind of knowledge is causing some power structures to be entrenched, right? Certain rules to be entrenched or certain resource distributions to remain entrenched. and keep reproducing themselves, right? So that this inequality perpetuates. So if that knowledge is made obvious, if it is pointed out that okay, it is this source of knowledge which is causing these issues, then conversely, there can be resistance movements which can build up, right? Where people will start realizing that, okay, this is the kind of knowledge that we need to counter. Therefore, there is always the scope for these distributions to keep changing. Yeah. So the bottom line, right, basically from this discussion was that you can think of power in terms of these 3 to 4 dimensions. One is in terms of resources. Who has access to resources that give them the influence to affect outcomes of decisions, who give them decision-making power? Then you think in terms of rules, that certain rules, right? So here you can talk about rules of the internet, for example, right? Or algorithmic rules, right? Right, that with algorithms, you're actually encoding certain rules in the technology. Now, these rules are therefore resulting in certain kinds of outcomes. So the rules at this level, right, there are certain rules which are influencing these outcomes. At the next level, you're talking about how can I change these rules? How can these rules be modified, right? So that gives you 3 different levels at which you can examine, right? And then there is, Foucault talks about the 4th level where new power structures can emerge, existing ones can be challenged, right? Right. So this becomes useful because when we then talked about last time, we talked about the gig economy, right? So with the gig economy, we saw that the argument in this paper was that there is a lot of algorithmic control, right? That the system is able to impose control on drivers in terms of ratings and so on. It doesn't take accountability for search pricing and whether it's working out properly or not. And it has also led to this legal question that because the algorithms are actually controlling the workers, which means that Uber and all of these companies are not neutral players, that it is not that these particular rules which are used to distinguish whether somebody is a worker or somebody is a contractor, right? Somebody is an independent entrepreneur and he's just using Uber as a means to access leads, right? So because you have so much of control, right? So that becomes an argument that the worker is not really free and the worker is under control of the entity that is running these algorithms, right? So this is essentially something like a level 2 power relationship, right? That the technology that there are certain rules encoded in the technology which result in workers losing decision making power and Uber as a company holding on to that decision making power. Yeah, that's one of the ways to think about it, right? You can also think in terms of level 1 in terms of resources, because people may not, the drivers for example, right, because maybe of technology literacy barriers or right, or in the case of other systems where they may not have access to grievance redressal procedures, right? So those become level 1 power relationship factors, that levels of education or amount of monetary resources that you have, that could also shape whether you're able to influence decision making outcomes or not. Yeah, right. So this is exactly right. Now how do you fix that? Well, one way is social audit, where the Fair Work platform, so they collect data from the workers directly and they try to give this kind of a rating. So essentially something like a social audit, that you're now building in new rules into the system, right? You're introducing certain new rules which are trying to keep a check on misuse of power. Yeah. So you have now at the level 2, well, you had power, level 3 power, that you had the ability to make certain rules. And then once these rules come into picture, they are able to counter some of the rules that were giving Uber that kind of decision making power, yeah, over their workers. Yeah. So it's interesting to think in this way, right, of how you can think in terms of resources, rules, and rule making ability. Yeah. And then new rules can be introduced which can counter power imbalances. Yeah. Then similarly, we looked at digital identity platforms last time, right? So again, here, once the technology was introduced, what it meant was that now there were certain rules that were enforced in terms of who's able to control, right, who gets ration or not. Now, because right, technology then introduces technology literacy issues, so it introduces new intermediaries, and then these new intermediaries are the ones who gain that power over people because they have more knowledge, right? They have more knowledge in terms of fixing some of these problems, and therefore those who don't, they become dependent upon them, right? So this is level one, but this level one was of course enabled by introducing new rules that, okay, now you can only access entitlements through Aadhaar based authentication. Yeah. And then what is a counter to this? Counter to this would be introducing rules that enable grievance redressal, right? So for example, people should be able to complain against these kinds of things, right? They should be able to, that even if authentication fails, the Supreme Court has said that ration cannot be denied, even if Aadhaar authentication fails, right? But it still happens on a routine basis, right? So grievance redressal would mean people being able to complain about it. Yeah. So that will introduce new rules into the setup, right? Right. So this is where we left off last time. And then what grievance redressal and social audit kind of procedures introduce is also what is now broadly known as transparency. Yeah. That now you would think that, well, if I introduce more and more transparency, then it can counter this power, right? So in many ways, you can think of transparency as analogous to privacy, right? Transparency meaning transparency of the actions of the powerful, right? That just like your personal data protection bill is essentially giving more power to the people in terms of ownership of the data, control over their data, and so on, right? So things like RTI can be argued that they are making the actions of the powerful more visible so that they can be questioned. So what this paper talks about is that actually it might not be that straightforward, right? Because even if you do make something transparent, right, that others are able to observe, right, they will not be able to do much with this information unless they can act upon it. So if, for example, you do make some of these problems like we were discussing with Aadhaar or even with social audit, for example, right, if you do make some of this data available, right, and right, so that there's more transparency. In the same way, you know that in India now, politicians are supposed to disclose their criminal history, their wealth, assets, and so on, right? So there is more transparency coming in. But the question is that can people act upon it? Is this actionable? Right? Now, in many cases, it may not be, right? That even though there is social audit and so on, but are there legal mechanisms to use social audit data to hold officials or companies accountable? Yeah, right. And how effective are these mechanisms? Right. So what this paper basically talks about is that one form of control that transparency is supposed to bring about is observational control. That if you can observe the actions of others, then you can have control over them, right? But it says that, well, it's not as straightforward, because ultimately, even if there is transparency, unless people are able to act upon it won't be useful. So the second kind of control that people talk about is regularizing control. You do start observing people and they will change their behavior, because now there is a threat that if there is some wrongdoing, then the transparency will make it visible, and if people are able to act upon it, then it is risky. And therefore, over time, it will change the behavior of people itself, behavior of the powerful itself. That now over time, though you might stop acting upon it very actively, there will still be a regularization that will get imposed, that in general the conduct will change, right? But this also, of course, depends that only once you are able to put some meaningful threat through observational control, only then will regularizing control become effective, right? So basically what the paper essentially talks about is that it's not that straightforward, but transparency and power can also work as a nexus, because they can make certain information visible but not give people the ability to act, or they can even make information visible very selectively, right? That maybe some kinds of information is made visible just in the name of transparency, but it's not really very useful, right? You can't impose much of observational control through it, and consequently in the long term much of regularizing control either, right? So meaning to say that in general, introducing new rules like putting in social audit and so on can be useful, but it's not implied, right? Right, those who have power can define the rules in certain ways, which enables them to still keep doing whatever they were doing. It doesn't cause them to change their actions or even their conduct in the long run. Right, so this is why things like RTI are very important, and watering down of RTI is something to speak against, right? Because RTI is that one tool which through transparency is putting more power in the hands of people, right? But if people don't have the ability to act upon it, or if RTI is watered down, that well certain functions can't be queried and so on, then it will reduce the effectiveness. Yeah. So very similarly, in Narega, right? Narega, you would know, is the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Narega has a very elaborate MIS behind it. MIS stands for Management Information System, right? So the MIS was introduced mostly in the name of transparency. That here actually you can drill down to and you can look at each and every individual record of a person itself, right? So you can actually, and it's all publicly visible, right? So you can drill down to the panchayat level, look at the list of beneficiaries, you can go to that beneficiaries detail, and you can look at all of the records of that person, that what all work has that person done, what were they paid, and so on, right? So one of the main reasons for doing this was to make all of this information transparent, partly so that those who are working in Narega, they could check, right, what wages have been paid, and then they can actually compare it with what wages have they actually received, right, and look at if there's any difference or not. Similarly, because Narega functions are based on public funds, right, it is public expenditure, so that is another reason why the right allocation of that expenditure should be public, so that anybody can come and take a look. And it also becomes a means for the government officials themselves to keep a check on one another, right? Because there is corruption in terms of what works are sanctioned, in which panchayat, how many works are sanctioned, right? Whose beneficiaries and so on. So you would have, of course, heard about all of those issues, right? So the point was that if we put all this information publicly, even senior officials can keep a check on junior officials. Yeah, and the idea was that there's a lot of corruption that happens at the junior level, at the local level, right? So this was done, right? Algorithms were also imposed where, for example, workers were allocated randomly to work sites. So meaning that you could not, right, if certain, let's say a middleman would collect job cards and get some work sanctioned, and actually that work may not actually be done in practice, right? But then this middleman would pocket the money, and maybe they would just distribute some small cash to the people whose job cards they took for this purpose, right? So to counter this practice, they said that, well, we'll allocate workers randomly to work sites. So if there are multiple work sites, we'll allocate workers randomly, so that, right, this nexus that the middleman could build, that would become weaker. Similarly, field staff appointments, right, that we'll randomly appoint field staff to different blocks or panchayats at whatever level you are working, so that if that staff has prior relationships with the sarpanch or with the block officer, then those will not be useful, right? So right, so again, to reduce corruption. Yeah. But then, even though once the system was put into place, right, there were all these interesting things which happened, right? So right, so a field staff was assigned randomly, but then the politicians still had some authority, and they could block, right? So now the algorithm picks three, and the politician and program officer, they are the ones who then choose, right? So basically, there was resistance from politicians who still had a lot of power over who was allocated, who was assigned what position, because then this becomes a means for continuing their corruption. Yeah. And then they started allocating workers randomly to work sites, but then people started also working on other people's cards, right? So that particular problem was also not entirely solved, right? Right. Then several misleading indicators, that definition of what is an active job card, right? That also is suspect, that even if one day was work was done in the last 3 years, that was also called an active job card, right? Right. So the reason why we're bringing it up again is that it may not be very straightforward, right? That by bringing in certain algorithms, or just by making information publicly visible, it may not really always lead to changes in the power structures, right? So wage payments, there's still delays in wage payments that happen because the MIS is also online. It's actually not possible for the workers to access the MIS directly. yeah, because they are not web savvy and everything, right? So in fact, very recently at Gramani, we did a very interesting quick project that in Meghalaya, when during the COVID pandemic lockdown last year, the government had announced a lot of cash transfers. So there's a trade union in Meghalaya that put in an RTI that what cash transfers have been made, and more than almost 1.5 lakh records were given to the union. And this had the phone number of the person, the name of the person, and what amount was given to them. So because there was a phone number, so at Gramani, we did a quick IVR survey of all of these people. That according to the record, you were paid so much. Did you actually get it? Did you get the same amount or less amount, and so on? And more than we could, and then we also set up a very quick website where NGO workers on the ground could query the system on behalf of the people. So overall, we got almost 15,000 people who reported, well, more than 40,000 responded on the IVR. And so we got data about what amount was given actually to people, what amount did they receive. But we also got about 15,000 people who said that they want to file a grievance. And then the trade union has actually now put in a grievance which has all these 15,000 names listed of people who were paid a particular amount, and they are however saying that, and which doesn't match the amount according to the government record. So this is like a 300-page list of people along with the letter and everything, which has now been sent to the Meghalaya government. So let's see what happens, right? But broadly, the point is that, again, just putting information online, right, is not useful if it is not actionable by people. So essentially what we did over here was that we made this information available to people through a voice-based system, which even less literate people can access. And then as a result, many of them actually wanted to file a grievance, and then we facilitated that process. Yeah. So again, the broad point being that, again, this notion of, right, who has the three-level notion of power, right? Whether people have the resources to act, or whether rules enable them to act, or whether they can make these new rules, right? That becomes important. Also to understand how to counter systems, right? How to counter entrenched power structures. Right. Similarly, we've talked about land records. So again, we'll go fast, right? We've talked about some of these things earlier also, but yeah, with land records, the idea is that, right, well, you're digitizing them and so on, and that's going to reduce corruption. And when this Bhumi system was introduced, and according to the government reports, mutation has gone up, land-based litigation has gone down. But when you actually get into the details, then you find that earlier the mutation took 2 to 3 days, but now it takes several months, because now the whole thing has been centralized because of technology, and which means that earlier people were able to work with the local patwari to get some of these mutations approved, but now there are agents to whom they have to go, because, right, these agents are the ones who know how the technology works, and right, there are other problems that have been introduced. Plus, transparency also has been an issue, because now, once these land records are available publicly, or maybe not all of them are available publicly, but there is data leakage, right? So ultimately, these land records are with government officials at the end of the day, and you can bribe them, you can pay them to get hold of them, and that has led to NRIs, for example, buying land at very low prices from certain vulnerable communities, and right, because they knew where in what areas development is more likely to happen, and they were able to buy off some of this land from poor communities ultimately, right, who may not be that aware that what's actually the price of the land that they should actually be entitled to. So again, the point basically is that how when you introduce technology, it can change the dynamics between different stakeholders, and it can entrench certain power structures, or it could change some of this. But you need to think critically. What are the outcomes that these new structures are leading to, right? Because the technology can actually empower somebody and take power away from other people, and this could lead to increasing inequalities if it's not done correctly. And then at the same way, you can introduce counter rules but those also may not be very, very straightforward, right? So things like transparency, it may work or it may not work if it's not done properly, right? So any of these systems, therefore, we can examine it through this lens of, right, who has the resources to use the systems, what are these rules that it's trying to enforce, and who is able to make these rules. Yeah. So I'll skip this. These are just more examples, right, of what happens when you introduce MIS systems within organizations. This is a very old paper, but a very, very classic paper of, right, when you introduce MIS systems within organizations to, let's say, keep track of HR processes, right, management decisions, then you have very similar dynamics playing up, right? That who is ultimately the technology empowering, which becomes important. Yeah. Right. And then we've seen this example, right, that the algorithms that you also try to impose to correct the behavior, they may not always work. So here there's another lens, right, through which you can look at algorithms. So here the example that's given is again with Uber, where an observation was made that female drivers earn 7% less on Uber than male drivers do, right? So it raised the question that is there gender discrimination in the algorithms, right? So an audit study was done where they looked at a lot of, right? So this is a dependency graph of variables. So they basically analyze each and every edge, right? So this model was constructed based on the domain knowledge of what are these relationships between variables, and then each of these edges was tested, that do these edges have any relationship. And then the study eventually concluded that the algorithms are not imposing any gender bias, right? But then critical questions are raised, right, that actually women drop off the platform far more than men. Right now, this point wasn't questioned by the paper, that women have a 2.7x rate of dropping off than men drivers, and that indicates that okay, there is harassment that might be happening in this whole process, and that is why women drop out from these jobs, right? Or there was a relationship that was discovered that driver speed is related to customer satisfaction. And this again could have an influence that if women drive faster, then it could be perceived negatively. And there was no link that was studied between speed and accidents. Right. So the main point of this argument was that even when you do a discrimination analysis, right, there are many social factors that you may not have considered, which render whatever changes you may do in the algorithm, right? Maybe the algorithm earlier was gender biased, and maybe Uber did something to make it less gender biased, right? So that's great. So maybe the algorithms were used to counter, right, to change the rules at level 2, so that now the power could be more equally distributed. But there are other issues that might come up, which are outside of the control of the algorithm, right? And that then essentially says that, well, just changing the rules themselves might not be sufficient, because rules inside the technology might not be sufficient, because there are many other social processes that are also affecting the outcomes, and on which technology may not have much control, right? So that's right. So that's yet another argument that you might say that now to make something more power equal, I will change the algorithms. But the point is that just like transparency, even these algorithmic changes may not solve the issue. So in this book, right, Fairness in Machine Learning, they also say that when you introduce machine learning, then you're also ultimately also shifting power among different stakeholders. Right? So there are different stakeholders in this whole process when you build machine learning systems, right? That you need to collect the training data, you need to label the data. There are domain experts who then provide inputs on what the algorithm should be doing. Machine learning experts who are essentially coding these rules into the technology, right? And then policymakers were enabling all of this ultimately. So when you do introduce machine learning systems, then yet another effect that happens is that you change the power relationships between all these different stakeholders who are actually building or who are part of the technology. Right? So decision subjects, who are the users, they are represented just as feature vectors, and we talked about informatization, and we'll talk more about it as we go on, that that not all of their features, or they may not have been described appropriately. The training, those who are labeling, they might also be labeling based on certain, right, where it could reinforce some of the biases. The role of the experts is also reduced because the expert knowledge has been shifted into the machine learning systems, right? So ML experts are elevated, and policymakers define the power configuration between these different stakeholders, but ML experts are basically elevated in lieu of domain experts. And therefore, right, it becomes harder, right? Then there need to be certain additional processes where the domain experts are able to audit the systems to check whether they're working properly or not, right? But if you just naively introduce machine learning systems, then that's the problem that is happening. Yeah. So the broad argument, therefore, again over here is that as you introduce algorithms, you might be introducing algorithms with a very noble objective, right? That I'll change the rules which are causing, bringing inequality, but that may not be very straightforward, right? So just like in this case, there could be external social processes that could be influencing. Over here, the argument is that the relationships also, right? When you do introduce algorithms, you're also fundamentally changing the relationships. So if experts are the ones who are supposed to keep a check on the system, right, and you're trying to algorithmize their function, you're also taking power away from them, right? So you again need to think about processes so that they can remain involved, right? So this is where you talk about human in the loop systems, which we also discussed in the past, right? You talk about algorithmic accountability, right? So all of those processes become critical, that they need to be in the picture if this introduction of technology is meant to really change and bring more power equality. Yeah, right. So another term that we will hear quite a bit is that of trust, right? That now we understand that if we think of it from this 3 level, right, then at level 3, we know that we then need to keep adapting. We need to keep adapting and keep building new rules, right? So how do you build an environment at level 3 where introduction of new rules becomes easier, so that you're able to introduce new rules to counter any or modify some rules that might be bringing inequality at level 2, or you're able to make rules that distribute the resources at level 1 more equally among people, yeah, so that there is more equality, right? So therefore, one term that you will often come across is that of trust, that if there is trust among the stakeholders, then they will be willing to discuss and talk to one another and modify these rules, right? So how do you bring trust, right? So this paper, it's not directly about it, but I've mentioned it because it's motivated by that logic, that if there is trust among the stakeholders, then they will meaningfully come together and discuss and modify rules. And so it tries to do this in the urban context where there is very little trust between citizens and municipalities typically. And therefore it says that, well, how can I bring citizens and municipality officials together? So unfortunately, this experiment was unsuccessful, and for different reasons, because they weren't able to build a robust enough software, and the use case that they thought about was not very practical, right? So that particular experiment failed. But the point is that it was motivated that they tried to identify what are sources of mistrust between citizens and municipal officials. And then they said that, well, if our system can bring more trust between these entities, then they will co-develop certain rules to come together, right? Right. So the point is that trust among stakeholders is said to be one aspect through which they can come together, and they might be able to modify some entrenched power structures at different levels. Yeah. So I'll come back right now. One counter argument to this is that trust, right? Should you think of it in terms of trust, or should you think in terms of setting up agonistic systems, agonistic environments, right? So what does agonistic mean? Agonistic is something that is continuously in conflict, right? And they say that, well, it said that in general, social systems, you will never have a perfect consensus. They will always be in conflict, and therefore, what you need is to create spaces for constructive debate. Yeah. So an agonistic environment, right, is more important so that different stakeholders can come together, they can debate, and they can arrive at much better rules or much better resource distribution at level 2 and level 1 respectively. Yeah, right. And right. So the argument is that we may desire an end to conflict, but if we want people to be free, then we must provide an arena where differences can be confronted. Yeah. And right, so that is the main point. Right, so this paper talks about it from the point of view of algorithms, that are algorithms agonistic or not, that do algorithms allow debate to happen, or how algorithms are instantiated, right? Do they allow debates to happen? So it talks more about that. But the point is that, so an example that they bring up is, so if you look at Facebook versus Wikipedia, and I think we discussed this a little bit, but in Wikipedia, all comments are visible, which means that whenever you're editing something, you're giving a justification of editing, right? All of that debate and discussion is available. And you can look at the history of any page to understand what were the debates that went through before that particular page was, before the current state of the page, right? Now, versus if you compare it to social media platforms like Facebook or YouTube, where also there is debate where you can mark certain posts as objectionable, but none of that history is ever made available, right? That history disappears. So basically, that whether a debate really happened, or who resolved the issue, who made a decision finally as to whether a post should be allowed or not allowed, right? All of that. So one, we don't even know whether a discussion or debate really happened, and second, whatever objections may have also happened, ultimately end up disappearing. Yeah. So this is an example where you would say that Wikipedia, the way the page and processes are structured, is it promotes agonism, it promotes debate, and it encourages you to arrive at certain agreements. But whereas others, of these social media platforms, they do not. Yeah, right. So again, right, bringing back to our discussion, right, the point is that, especially when it comes to the point about an environment to make these rules, right? So then you're talking about the nature of this environment, that is there trust between people, or are there spaces for agonism, so that people can come together and discuss these issues. So that becomes important to think in terms of bringing more power equality at level 2 or level 1. Yeah. Right. So in the same, at yet another aspect to think about over here is also that of knowledge. Right. So we've talked about knowledge, right? In the way Foucault describes it, that those who can control meaning, those who can control knowledge, right, ultimately are the ones who can also influence at level 3, right? What rules will come into the picture, what rules will get created. Gillespie in this paper talks about how the current objectivity that people normally perceive towards algorithms, that we perceive algorithms to be always correct, right, that is changing our very perception of knowledge. Yeah. So he says that this is introducing a new knowledge logic, that as opposed to earlier, you would attribute knowledge to what credentialized experts would say, or what the scientific method would say, or common sense, or the word of God, right? And right now he says that because algorithms have right, knowledge produced by algorithms is actually being elevated to an extent that it's countering other forms of knowledge that we have considered important so far. Yeah. And he therefore takes a critical look at that, right? That if this becomes more and more accepted, then what it means is that algorithms would end up managing, right, even the meaning that people attach to many different aspects of society. And right here you get into all sorts of problems like informatization, that what parts have the algorithms really informatized, because only that then they make visible, and only that will be what people then end up discovering, right? So all the issues that we've seen with algorithms, right, in terms of fairness, bias, and right, all of that again become important over here. That if the knowledge produced by these algorithms is considered to be correct and it ends up shaping people, just like some of us might believe experts to be more correct, some of us might trust scientific methods more, some of us might trust common sense, or some of us might be religious and trust whatever, right, has been written in religious scriptures. So right, so this knowledge produced by the algorithms could also become, if it gets elevated to that status, then it can actually similarly shape meaning in people's minds, and this meaning would be biased by so many of the issues that we've seen with algorithms. Yeah. So right, so that's what this paper basically talks about. Similarly, so you can look at some of these papers. They're quite straightforward and simple to read. Algorithms can be wrong many times, right? So and similarly, this paper then says that algorithms, right, just like we might think of people as actors who are imposing power over other people, we should also think about algorithms as actors themselves, because these actors are actually have the potential to change meaning itself, to change what meaning people are perceiving, what knowledge people are considering to be important. So the point being that the algorithms itself also need to be considered as active agents who are trying to gain power over, let's say, experts, or over public opinion that you might build through media, right? So in summary, right, the point is that now in summary, what we've seen is that, right, we've seen that certain characteristics of technology like hierarchical management or rules of engagement, right, are enforced by technology. Yeah. And power can be a lens, right? So three levels at which we examine power: resources that provide decision-making power at level 1. Level 2 is rules and structures to make decisions. And level 3 is the power to make rules and structures. Right? Right. And in general, we've seen feedback loops like social audit and grievance redressal can bring more equality at these levels. But transparency through some of these feedback loops, right, it's not guaranteed that it will always work. Right? These rules, new rules of transparency need to be defined carefully. Right? Similarly, just rejigging the algorithms alone may not be sufficient, because the algorithms themselves might skew the power dynamics among stakeholders. Certain things the algorithms will not be able to solve, like if the social processes themselves are biased, then again it won't solve. Now, to fix some of these, therefore, it becomes important to think that at level 3 there should be an environment of which is more democratic, where there is more trust, right? But another way to also think about it is in terms of this environment being an agonistic space, so that debate and criticism can happen openly. Yeah. Then the additional aspect which links to about whether algorithms themselves can solve some of these problems is that algorithms could actually even shape knowledge, and therefore algorithms themselves should be considered as actants themselves, which might be favoring certain stakeholders, or which might enable certain kinds of knowledge and meaning, which can change many of these trust dynamics, or agonistic spaces, or the ability of people to discuss and debate. Yeah, because the algorithms could change the meaning itself of how people perceive the world. Yeah. So fairly complex and high level, but it's very important to realize these issues, because right, otherwise what we've seen so far in the previous modules is that we largely saw that how can we modify the technology itself, right, to make it more ethical, right, in terms of the user interface, or in terms of how we manage and treat the data, or in terms of can we remove biases in algorithms and so on, right? But here we are saying that we need to think of it even more broadly than that, because just changing the technology artifact may not be sufficient, right? Because the technology artifact has much wider impacts on society. And therefore, you need to think in terms of, well, if you've introduced a particular artifact, what new rules should you also introduce so that that artifact works properly? But introducing those new rules, right, is not straightforward. Changing the algorithms alone is not straightforward. You need to observe what new rules to build. You need a trustworthy environment. You need agonistic spaces, right? Plus, you need to be careful that the algorithms themselves are not elevated to such a status that they start changing the meaning of how people perceive the world, right? If the knowledge produced by biased algorithms is considered to be correct, then it will lead to all sorts of more wide-ranging issues. Yeah. So that's the point over here, and with this part of the talk. Yeah. So any questions, any points on this?
So I believe algorithms are good in terms of like it's basically designed what developers have in their mind, but even the implementers who implement the algorithms, they feed the data in a way that looks like algorithm is correct. So there is no way to change the algorithm based on the data we receive, because data is always wrongly fed to the system, and it says that algorithms are perfect. So that could be one another angle which needs to be taken care. Basically, the data validity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, correct, exactly. So that data validity is essentially a part of, right, being able to question this knowledge logic with which we perceive algorithms today, right? So we look at it in more detail, right? So this is, right, called taking a critical view. So for example, big data, right, is used, right? So you hear this term quite a lot, but there is a critical way to look at big data also, right? That this big data that you're using to derive certain observations, to detect anomalies and so on, right? How correct is that data itself? Yeah, because if the data itself has issues in it, then you will never be able to get the truth out of it, right? Because data could have issues, right? Data, right? There could be informatization issues that maybe only some part of the data exists, some processes have not been observed, and therefore it's not there in the data at all, right? Or maybe there could be issues in data collection, there could be issues in what data sets have been brought together, what is the sampling of these data sets, do they reflect more about. So in face recognition, for example, we saw that the reason why these face recognition algorithms were working better for whites than for blacks was because there was more data about whites. And that was largely because more white people were on social media than black people, and that again was because of income and various other social inequalities, right? So the same issues will then also get reflected in the data. So if you're using some of this data to drive your decisions or to inform the world of new knowledge, right, then that becomes a problem, because that data fundamentally is questionable in terms of its sampling, in terms of its quality, in terms of its exhaustiveness, and therefore the knowledge which is being produced based on the data is just as questionable. Yeah. So that's the idea that, right. So what Tufiki over here is saying is therefore that because algorithms, big data, I mean they're calling it algorithms, but largely you can just substitute technology for algorithms also if you want, right? That when we're elevating technology to that status that it can actually influence what we perceive, or it can influence our knowledge, then we need to even model these technology or these algorithmic systems as actors themselves, as active agents themselves who are influencing. And therefore, you then need counter rules to make sure that knowledge produced by big data is not the only source of knowledge, or it is not elevated to a status that it becomes equivalent to like expert knowledge, for example. Yeah.
so can we say data itself as an actor? Because if some algorithm is not able to capture some part of the data, or maybe it's a different data which is not being fed to the system, it's completely unknown to the algorithm itself.
Yeah.
So data might show up or end up with a wrong trends or results, which may itself go into a loop and go on.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a good thought. I have not thought so much of that. That can data itself be also modeled as an actor itself? But yeah, maybe that could be useful, right? Of modeling the data, emphasizing on its properties which are useful, or problems with the data, and which then has further ramifications. Cool. So any other points?
Sir, as you said that the domain experts are replaced by the algorithms and more power has been shifted to the algorithmic experts. So it was also pointed out in one of the paper by Gary Marcus, namely a deep learning, a critical appraisal, where he pointed out that the future direction lies in incorporating the domain knowledge into the deep learning frameworks, because currently deep learning practitioners are only focused on the efficiency and how effective the model performs, and not on the domain knowledge.
Hmm. Yeah, no, very good point. Yeah. So exactly. There are all these very good research directions, right? So like you mentioned, similarly in deep learning systems also, now people are trying to see how, right, some, let's say, scientific laws can be modeled into the deep learning architectures themselves, right? So that it doesn't be the case that they're just learning based on the data, and they might learn some weird laws, right? So very much like fairness and bias, it takes a similar approach, that you're still trying to minimize your loss, but subject to none of these existing known scientific principles being violated. Yeah, just like earlier we saw that, okay, there are all these different fairness definitions that are there. We want to minimize the loss subject to these, whatever definition we wanted to use, that particular definition is not violated, so it becomes a constraint. So in the same way, this is another direction now, that how can some of these laws be also modeled into the architecture itself. Yeah, so that's correct. That makes sense. But the argument, however, I think goes beyond that also, right? Because even with this argument, the point is that you will only be able to encode that knowledge which can be objectified, right? And therefore you are able to put that into the deep learning architectures. You're able to introduce that as a constraint or whatever way to model it, right? But that knowledge has to be objectified. Only then can it be encoded, right? But there might be, it will still, you can still argue that it will still take the power away from domain experts, because it's possible they might be making some decisions based on gut instinct or based on their experience, and some of those may not be so easily quantifiable, right? So this is the same thing that we saw, that if you try to introduce algorithmic decision making in judicial systems, right? So over there, a judge could be making a decision based on many factors. Maybe the age of the person, maybe their economic background, maybe, right, some context that the person has, and all of these things end up impacting the decision. Now, to the extent you can objectify all of those, you can introduce those into algorithms. But there are some things that you might not be able to objectify, you might not be able to computationalize. That is what the paper actually means when it's, if we try to computationalize everything, then also we are taking power away from these domain experts. And that is why, because there is always this risk that your computationalization might be imprecise, right? You may not be able to objectify each and everything. Therefore, you need to put up counter rules in place so that domain experts can still question the output of the algorithms. Yeah. So you get the point?
Yes, sir. As you mentioned, human in the loops systems are required.
Yeah, exactly. So human in the loop systems, accountability procedures, right? So these counter rules, so that they can counter, right, whatever power issues or power reconfigurations might be introduced by technology. So yeah, so try to go over this again, right? Try to right, because it's very conceptual and sort of abstract. but it's useful, right, to think in terms of, right, how technology can change social relationships among people, and that you can think of it in terms of power at three different levels, in terms of resources that people possess, in terms of rules that are used to make decisions, in terms of how to make these rules in the first place. And here you need some of these counter procedures like human in the loop systems, algorithmic accountability, and so on. You need transparency, but that alone may not be always sufficient. Similarly, just changing the algorithms may not be always sufficient, right? And you need environments which are trustworthy and agonistic, and you also need to take care that the algorithms or the knowledge of the algorithms is not elevated to that extent that it impacts your ability to change these rules. Yeah. So think more on these points, because conceptually, I mean, they will have a wide implication on how technology basically changes these relationships among people. What I wanted to quickly go through is a area called systems thinking, right? So systems thinking basically says that, well, okay, now just like over here, we've been saying that it changes power relationships among people, right? And there are various dynamics, right? Some rules are meant to counter other rules. They're meant to correct problems created by other rules. They're meant to counter, right? So if there is inequality that few people possess all the resources, most people have nothing, then how do you reconfigure, right? So systems thinking is a discipline. It's an engineering discipline which talks about modeling relationships basically between elements. So the main point that it says is that you should model the system in terms of all of its different components and the relationships between these components. So the whole point that systems thinking talks about is that see the whole thing, right? To see the world in its completeness, and to study all these relationships. So here's some examples that it talks about, right? That this is how a thermostat, for example, functions. You have a thermostat setting, and you're continuously measuring the room temperature, and you're looking at what is the difference between the actual room temperature and what you have on the thermostat. And that is controlling, that you use to control that how much heat should be let into the room. Yeah. And then because it is cold outside, so the room is also losing heat to the environment, and there is an outside temperature, so there is a discrepancy between the inside and outside temperatures as well, right? So this you can use to control like whether to open a window, for example, or not, right? So the point is to think in terms of these feedback loops, that there is this relationship between different entities, and these feedback loops become decisions, it become important decision points to regulate the room temperature, right? So in the same way, there are many complex systems that they have modeled, right? So for example, this one is about relationship between economy and resource extraction, like mining, for example, or fisheries, right? So the idea is that you have a resource, right, a finite natural resource, and you're extracting it. Now the rate at which you're extracting it, that is driven by capital, right? You put in more capital, you can increase the extraction rates. Yeah, this extraction rate also drives profit, and similarly, right, the efficiency of your technology of extraction drives how efficiently you're able to extract resource, and ultimately it leads to profit. So this profit is what also controls your capital growth. That if you have a high profit, you will get a lot more investment, your capital will grow, and you will be able to drive extraction even further. So there is a positive feedback loop basically that you're seeing over here. That once this process kicks in, it can start growing very rapidly, because then more and more investment would come in, capital would expand, more extraction would occur, technology would become more efficient, more profit, and more investment, right? The counter is very weak. Counter is basically some depreciation, right? And here you have not modeled externalities like the pollution or environmental effects. So because these environmental effects have not been modeled, you get a positive feedback loop over here, and you're not able to counter, right, this depletion of the natural resource. Yeah. So then it led to more complicated systems, right, where you're looking at you're trying to model externalities like effect of pollution on population and so on, right? So again, right, we don't need to go into the details to understand all of this, but right, but the idea is that once you model a system in terms of its components, in terms of the relationships between components, and in terms of, right, you're getting feedback and you're changing your actions based on this feedback, right? So that's what systems thinking is trying to actually tell you. And then this is how, right, so there are you can make simulators, and what these simulations can basically do is that for different settings, so if your consumption goal is 1 or 2 or a very high consumption goal, then this sort of also can tell you that over time, are you stabilizing at some point, that is your population stabilizing and your pollution and so on, or are you, right, if your consumption goal is very high, then are there some erratic outcomes that you can expect. Yeah, right. So there's a bunch of such examples like fisheries as well, right, which, right, talk about, right, how many fish there are, what is the extraction rate, and how many boats there are, and right, and based on the number of boats and so on, which, and investment is also a factor over here, that if you're able to extract fish and sell, and that drives investment, right? So here basically talk about that how can you build that if there are some positive feedback loops which can get reinforced, then how do you control them? How do you counter them with some negative feedback loops that can restore stability to the system, right? So this is exactly actually what we have been discussing, right? That if you have certain rules which are increasing inequality, sort of like positive feedback loops, then what sort of counter rules can you introduce? Like we've been talking about the transparency and so on, right? So what kind of counter rules can you introduce so that these systems become more equal, and they reduce the power inequality which can come up. So they reduce the positive feedback loops, the implication of the positive feedback loops. So there's some construction going on over here now, it seems. Right. So there is this whole area called systems thinking or systems engineering, which I think is quite useful. And there's something I'm trying to study more to see, and right, that can some of it be used in some of the power modeling that we've been talking about. Right. So the engineering approach in systems thinking can be hard to apply in social systems. So there's also something called soft systems methodology, which does something very similar, right? Which essentially models all the different actors, what are the relationships among these actors, and then it tries to basically find out that how can you restore more stability in the system. So there is this method where it talks about who are the customers, actors. So it does this more from an organizational standpoint, that how can organization be more stable in a changing world. So it talks about that the organization has customers, it has actors like employees and workers, board manager, board of directors. There are certain transformations that it builds. There is a certain worldview or goal of the organization. There are certain goals of the owner of the organization, and then there are certain environmental constraints that you might want to also follow, right? So based on all of this, the idea is again that you write it down, you describe these relationships. Hopefully through that, you will be able to spot places in the system which need more attention, or which need some redistribution of resources, or which need some new counter rules to be introduced so that the effect of positive feedback loops is reduced, right? So this is and ultimately it's all guided by trying to model the entire system, right? All the different actors and their relationships with each other, right? So I think that's the key point in this whole systems thinking approach to take away, right? For thinking about also technology, that technology, once it's introduced, changes all these social relationships, and certain rules can be reinforcing, and therefore you need certain counter rules to keep a check. Yeah. If it is too abstract, then I'd say you can skip this. But this is something I've actually been trying to do. When it comes to power, right? People have, just like the 3 to 4 levels of power, people have also conceptualized what are different types of power. So one is power over, where one actor has power over others in curtailing their freedom. There's power to, which gives the power to do something to certain people, right? It could be through resources that they possess. And then there's another notion called power with, that in collectives, when people come together, then they gain power because they are working with each other. And then there is another notion called power within, where confidence or self-esteem, self-confidence that you have, that also gives you the power to act, to take decisions, and so on. So these become useful typologies to think about, right? That similarly, when we introduce technology, right, what does it do, right? So like at the first level, where you talk about resources, that if you have nodes or actors that have power over others due to inequitable resource distribution, right? Then you can address this by redistribution of resources that give power to others, and which reduces the dependency on these nodes. Right? So this is, you can think of like intermediaries in Aadhaar, that they gain power over others, but then if you're able to redistribute the knowledge or skills to people, then you're essentially giving power to them, which will reduce the dependency on these intermediaries. Yeah. At the second level, you have centralization of power over others through discretion in rule making. And that is what gives some actors power over other actors. And this can be countered by introducing accountability loops through transparency procedures, social audit, and so on, right? Which again gives power to the others to counter these dominant power over rules. Yeah. And then at the third level, you need collective action, right? So that through collective action, you are able to gain power with others to counter some of these hegemonic power over relationships that may have emerged, right? So this is something, right, again, right, useful typologies to help us understand all of this. So I skip this. I've tried to model some of this. So for example, right, what we've been talking about, if somebody needs entitlements, but there is some discretionary power, let's say with the ration owners or with the sarpanch and so on, then you can have media, which is acting as a transparency agency or as a watchdog, which can keep a check on this power. Yeah. So similarly, other ways in which you can also model, right? So this is all, right? So you can look at chapter 6 if you're interested in my book. And right, so it's very preliminary right now, but this is where I'm trying to do some modeling. Let's see if it works out. Right now, taking that even further, right? When it comes to collective action, right? People have also talked about, right, how some of this power can emerge. So they talk about associational power that emerges when people associate with each other. Then they talk about structural power, that once this associational power, when people are able to associate with each other, then at the workplace there can be strikes, or in the marketplace they can control the labor supply, and that gives more structural power to change working structures. As some of these powers emerge, it can also introduce institutional power, where structural power is leveraged to change policy, to change the rules. And similarly, when many movements come together, it can actually change the structure of society itself. Right? So if worker movements come together with other social movements, these days, for example, the farmer protests which are ongoing, right? And trade unions or workers have also joined the movements. Many advocacy, transparency groups have joined, many feminist groups have also joined the movement, and the farmers are of course there, right? So these then have the potential to actually change how democracy itself can function, right? Right. So these are some interesting papers basically which talk about. So again, the typologies are useful, right? That just power alone may be too abstract a concept, but if you break it up, if you conceptualize it in this way of people gaining power through association with each other, gaining, right, being able to use that power in certain structures, being able to change the rules, and even then change the ways in which society works, then that can be quite useful. Right. Now, Manuel Castells is another very, very famous sociologist, theoretician. So he has also talked about the specific role that social media, for example, plays in some of this, right? So he calls it, right? He uses another typology where he talks about, right, that people are able to gain power through social movements and use technology for networking to run these movements in a better way. So he similarly talks about networking power, where to be able to use some of these social media platforms, you should have the resources to do that, right? So like access to the internet or knowledge of how to use the internet and so on, right? Then once you do that, right, you should be able to run the network itself, right? So if running a social media group or something, then you need skills to do that. Once that happens, then there is networked power which emerges, that the network will then be able to, just like over here, it will be able to apply itself in certain places at the associational, structural, institutional power that might emerge. And then these networks itself also operate on certain rules, right? So like the internet itself operates on certain principles of decentralization and anonymity. But if this structure itself is changed, then it will impact everything, right? So if the internet is not anonymous anymore, right? If, for example, right, your IDs are required for any kind of communication, then it means that it impacts all of these other processes as well. But the technologies of networking can affect your right, ability to do anything with the technology, right? So Casters talks about these things, right, of how these systems, technology systems, can bring power to different entities. Yeah. So this part of the module has been very abstract, right? I understand that. So you should really try to absorb, right? Go back to the slides, go to some of the papers and readings. I mean, that's where we are in this space, right? I think it's an open space for a lot more research. Yeah, but once you read, many of these concepts will come together. Yeah, right. Now maybe I'll revisit it again next time, right? So this is one view, however, right? Because this is important for the segue now into the next part, right? So the view that we've been talking about so far, right, is essentially that instead of just the technology design, we might be also able to control the system design, right, by imposing certain rules which can counter rules that entrench power or resources and so on, right? We'll be able to make the world a better place, right? We'll be able to impose more power based equality in the world. So essentially we're trying to find a solution, right? We're saying that the current state of the world is not good. We'll introduce technology, we'll introduce rules to govern technology, and we'll do all that, right? Which is also a part of design. That instead of just looking at the technology design, we will also look at the system design. We'll be able to solve the problem. Yeah. So what Rittel and Weber, right? They have a very famous paper, and in which they introduce this term called wicked problems, right? Dilemmas in a general theory of planning, right? So this paper is very fundamental because it basically says that, well, you can't solve social issues, right? No matter how you describe and model power, for example, or how you design algorithms and define the objectives of these algorithms, right? If you're doing that with a view to solve a particular problem, then that won't work. Yeah, because they basically say that social issues are fundamentally not solvable, right? In fact, right, so they say that social problems are never solved, they are only resolved over and over again. Because, right, their main point is that there are limits to rationalistic design. So we've also touched upon this a couple of times, that how accurately can you describe the world, right? How accurately can you actually even think about building rules to counter other rules and so on, right? That is always limited by what you're able to objectify, what you're able to computationalize. That is always limited. That will, right, this rationalistic thought process will always be limited. And that is why now in the next module, we will talk about the importance of managing, right? Importance of, right, which comes after the design. So you design something thinking that you've modeled the world, you've now figured out, right, how a particular system should operate. In a very rationalistic manner, you've defined all that, right? But Rittel and Weber then say that that's not possible. And this is also what then motivates us into the next module that we will look at next time on management. Yeah, that even after you design, you cannot take a step back. Technology systems will need continuous ongoing management to make sure that they don't go haywire. Yeah. So basically, right, they talk about many such things, that there is no definitive formulation of a social problem. That's one thing, because of which, right, if you can't even frame it properly, then how can you solve that social problem? Right? It varies with context, it's pluralistic. There are no stopping rules, they say in some of these, that you can't say that, okay, now I've solved it. There'll always be something new, something different that will come up. Solutions are not true and false, right? Only good or bad, because it is only relatively when you examine the situation that you know, well, am I better off than earlier or not, right? But there's no like optimal solution that you can get to. No immediate and no ultimate test that you've arrived at a solution, right? So there's no opportunity to learn from trial and error, because you can't go back in time, right? It's irreversible. So each time you make a decision or a policy decision or you do something, it's irreversible. You can't go back. No enumerable set of potential solutions or well described permissible operations. It's also unique that you cannot apply a solution which worked in a similar situation, right? Because each situation might be different. It can be considered as a symptom of another problem. Existence of a discrepancy can be explained in numerous ways. No single causal pathway or even testable causal pathway, right? So of course you can argue, right, that some of these might sound exaggerated, right? That in certain circumstances you will be able to say that I can test whether something has happened. I can test causality in certain situations, right? But the point, the broader point that they're basically making is that due to these limits of rationalistic processes, design itself is a rationalist process. That is what fundamentally limits it. That whether you're trying to design the technology in terms of the user interface or privacy or algorithms, or you're trying to design the technology and the social system in which the technology is embedded by building rules and everything, all of that will be limited. That's their bottom line. Yeah. And this is why they call these social problems as wicked problems. So that's the argument, that because of this, you need to, right, acknowledge the limits of rationalist approaches, keep an open mind about solutions, adopt an argumentative process, and focus on capacity building for argumentation and constructive conflict management, right? So this is exactly what we'll now start looking at in the next part. That even though you might think that you've designed everything very nicely, but it will still require ongoing management as you go on.